Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Thank you for coming today. We are being broadcast, so you need to that extent to watch anything you say, but you don't need to worry about being sued for libel if you say anything very rude, because we are protected by parliamentary privilege. You will get the transcript to correct any bits where you feel you misspoke or wish to correct the impression that you've given. You have, I think, a full list of the interest declared by members of the committee in front of you. I think that deals with the formalities. Could I start with you, John? Has polling got more difficult over the years?
Yes.
Why?
I think the principal problem is that response rates to surveys of any kind, including public opinion polls and political opinion polls, are lower. There is a literature out there which your specialist advisor can advise you on about the extent to which this does or doesn't create a problem, but I think there is probably a consensus that so far as political polling is concerned, it does potentially create a problem insofar as it probably increases the probability that any sample you obtain by whatever method contains disproportionately those who are interested in politics, and thereby, in turn, therefore, contains more people than you would find in the general population who are actually going to go to vote. Now, this has happened at a time when turnout itself has been persistently lower than it was certainly through to the 1997 and even the 2017 election. It was still below 70%, and clearly once turnout is lower, there is a greater probability that you get differential turnout of a kind that may be relevant to understanding what the outcome of an election is going to be. And I think certainly it's pretty clear from both the experience of 2015 and 2017 that estimating correctly who is not going to turn out, and particularly the differences in turnout between different demographic groups, is now one of the principal challenges facing the polling industry. So that's number one. Number two is, in part, thanks to the Brexit referendum, though not entirely as a result of thanks to the Brexit referendum, the social base of British politics is now different. By far and away the biggest discriminator of vote choice in the 2017 election was age. And coming back to my earlier remarks, age is much more clearly correlated with turnout, although the problem is that that correlation may be variable over time, even though the fact that younger people are less likely to vote is pretty much a constant. Meanwhile, and this is certainly one of the challenges that faced the polling industry during the EU referendum, it has not traditionally been the practice in most political polling of attempting to gather information on education, because educational attainment has not usually been particularly important once you knew somebody's occupational class position. But in the EU referendum, education mattered much more than social class. But measuring it, if you just think about, given the myriad of qualifications and arguments about the equivalence of qualifications, as you can imagine, collecting data accurately about educational attainment is a relatively difficult enterprise. So I think that's the widening and changing social basis of electoral choice in the UK has made things more difficult for the industry. That said, I mean, I don't think everything has got more difficult. There are clearly arguments about how internet polling should be conducted, and there are still arguments about its relative merits as opposed to telephone interviewing, but certainly the advent of the internet has radically changed the business model of the polling industry. It has very successfully succeeded in reducing costs, and to that extent at least doing polls, though whether this equates to doing polls well, I think has certainly become much easier for the industry than it was certainly 25, 30 years ago.
Okay, now polling's got more difficult. We've also had the facts of 2 elections where the polling industry performed rather poorly in terms of the outcome relating to its predictions, plus the Euro referendum, which your own paper suggests the last polls were pretty inaccurate. I mean, is this a problem for polling or a crisis for polling, or should we just abandon polling altogether because it's completely defunct?
First, it's clearly an embarrassment to the polling industry that its forecasts are not as accurate as they were like. I'd give you a slightly more nuanced answer than the premise of your question, in that, of course, the problem in 2015 was not that it got everything wrong. It's that, unfortunately, it got wrong the 2 things that most matter, the Conservative and Labour point. You laugh, but hopefully you have imbibed the evidence from Professor Jennings, which has explained to you why it's more likely that those 2 estimates are going to be wrong. And of course, given our electoral system, the thing above all you have to get right is the Conservative lead over Labour or vice versa. But actually, that's probably the most difficult thing to get right. But other things in 2015, e.g., and for example, the astonishing success of the Scottish National Party north of the border, which many people, even on the eve of polling day, say, no, this surely cannot possibly happen. The truth is, it's more or less exactly what happened. In the EU referendum, it is worth bearing in mind that if you take into account all of the polls that were conducted during the official campaign period, slightly more had Leave ahead than had Remain ahead. And I think it is perhaps one of those mysteries or eternal mysteries of history as to what would have happened if the referendum had been on June the 16th, at which point the vast majority of opinion polls were pointing to Leave being ahead, as to whether or not the polls would have been regarded as a glorious success which told the country something that it wasn't anticipating, but was in fact true. And that, there was a bit of a swing back, but I think what's also true about 2016 is a lot of people were assuming that the polls were going to be wrong because of the evidence that in some, but not in all referendums, there tends to be a swing towards the status quo towards the end. Now that expectation was exaggerated. So I think, insofar as there was something of a swing back in the polls in the last week of the referendum, albeit still 2 polls had Leave ahead, people then looked at that and then they then said, aha, right, oh, well, therefore it's obvious that Remain are going to win. The truth is, I think any sensible person who looked at the final polls for the EU referendum went, don't ask us who's going to win, we don't know. In 2017, of course, we've got this remarkable situation. We may want to come into detail this more later. In 2017, it's very clear that the problem is different from 2015. There is a historical issue with UK polling, which certainly goes back to the late 1980s, of which the polling industry has long been aware. Much of what it's been trying to do has been trying to overcome it, which is that Labour voters are just simply easier to find, and that there's been a tendency historically for the industry to overestimate Labour and underestimate the Conservatives. Of course, the intriguing thing about 2017 is they got the Conservatives spot on and they underestimated Labour. That is, certainly very unusual. Now, you then went on to say, given that somewhat patchy record, should we give up on opinion polls? Well, I would suggest to you that even in 2017, the opinion polls told you an awful lot of things that it was rather useful to know. They told you, for example, that actually the public were changing their minds about the merits of the Leader of the Opposition. They told you that the public were changing their minds about the merits of the Prime Minister. They also told you that the Labour manifesto was more popular than the Conservative manifesto. They told you that Brexit was indeed dividing voters, that voters who voted Leave were swinging towards the Conservatives, voters who voted Remain were more likely to swing towards Labour. They told you that age was becoming a major divide in British politics, and that those television pictures of young voters flocking to Jeremy Corbyn's meetings were actually a representation of something that was really going on in the electorate. They also told you, by the way, that the Conservative Party was going to do relatively well in areas that voted Leave, and the Labour were going to do better in places that Remain. There was an awful lot of political intelligence in these opinion polls for the discerning readers. So I think to suggest that because, I think we should remember that opinion polls I mean, expecting absolute pinpoint accuracy from opinion polls is probably unreal. Most opinion polls in most elections get it wrong at least a bit, okay? But to focus purely on the horse race and the pinpoint accuracy of the horse race, as opposed to giving you a reasonable impression of actually roughly where we are at, and in particular the way in which things are changing and the way that the things that are motivating voters, I would suggest to you that even in 2017 the opinion polls told you an awful lot that it was rather useful to know.
Well, what you've just said is that the opinion told us an awful lot you needed to know, except we didn't tell you who was in front. So maybe this committee should simply say that
well, with respect, Chairman,
we will permit opinion polls during election periods, except those purporting to give voting intentions, which we would ban.
With respect, Chairman, the opinion polls did tell you which party was ahead. It just exaggerated the extent to which that party was ahead. It's also true, by the way, of course, that two polling exercises in 2017 did actually tell you that the Conservative Party was at serious risk of losing its overall majority. Survation's final poll only had a 1-point lead, and YouGov, in its exercise in which it was engaged in taking a lot of data and modelling that data in order to work out what the outcome was going to be in seats using a new method developed by academics, actually slightly underestimated the Conservative tally. So even in 2017, there was enough out there. I mean, again, to be honest, from my perspective, I do not know why people were so surprised that the Conservatives lost their majority in 2017. Given the range of evidence, it was anything between perhaps the Conservatives getting a majority of about 60 and the Conservatives just losing their majority seemed to be within the range of possibilities, given the evidence being provided by the opinion polls, which at the end of the day, on average, said the Conservatives were 7 points ahead, which is exactly where they were in 2015, which only got you an overall majority of 12. Why does anybody think this points to clear evidence that the Conservatives are heading for a safe overall majority?
Thank you. Margaret, you wanted to come in.
Well, you have been extremely helpful, Professor Curtis, in illuminating something which I've been concerned about throughout this entire inquiry, which is about the importance of turnout, and specifically about the turnout issue in 2017, which you've described very effectively. You said that this has become now one of the major challenges facing the polling industry. How are they going to deal with it?
I think some of the polling industry will probably say that what we attempted to do in 2017, which was to estimate the probability of people voting merely on the basis of what happened at the previous election, was probably a mistake. I think also, personally, they probably also misapplied some of those methods as well. They compounded their errors, but that's another story. And that we probably do have to go back to relying on the self-reports of voters in terms of their reported probability of voting. But that's issue number one. Response number two to you, I think, is, for example, I mean, particularly, I'm not saying they're the only company to have done this, but certainly YouGov in particular, amongst others, have said, well, okay, if we are going to run internet polls on the basis of panels of people who in some sense or another have been recruited to doing these things in advance, we need to put much more effort into ensuring that amongst those panelists are people who are not that interested in politics. YouGov certainly have done that. I suspect other companies have done it. So part of the answer to you is improving the quality of the samples. And that in a sense comes back to the 2015 inquiry. But I think there is no doubt the most difficult thing to get right in any survey, any poll done before or after an election about politics is to get adequately right the turnout amongst those who are not terribly interested in politics, and that's always going to be it's one of the challenges that we have to live with.
But could I just follow that up? Because it seems to me that one of the things that you could have learned, I mean, all of this is so easy with hindsight, but between the referendum and the 2017 election, was that where you had differential turnout on the referendum, it favoured the Leave vote, and therefore all of the things you've described about the factors of, I don't know, age, education, whatever, and that it was perfectly possible to make a political judgment, not necessarily a polling one, that those who felt most angry about that result would be in a different demographic, i.e. the young, etc., more highly educated or whatever it was, who would then be attracted by the whole Corbyn example that you described of the, I don't know, the Glastonbury effect or whatever you want to call it. That would be perfectly possible, wouldn't it, to have made that political judgment, again, as I say, very easy with hindsight, but that could have made it possible to make a difference about the polling.
That's one way to look at it. I mean, to be honest, I mean, again, I'm now speaking in a personal capacity rather than for the BPC. I mean, my own view is, having looked at some of the detail of the polls, is that if the polls had simply assumed that the proportion of young voters in the electorate was the same in 2015, they would not have gone as astray as they did. I mean, to give you some idea, around 11% of 18 to 24, around 11% of the adult population is aged 18 to 24. According to the best estimates we have, about 9% of the electorate who voted in 2015 were 18 to 24. So you could say, and this is what some companies did, okay, we will attempt to weight our data so that we only have 9% of 18 to 24. The trouble is, if you actually look at some of the final polls, I got some of the numbers here, the proportion of 18 to 24-year-olds who were contributing to their final estimates, in one case was 4, another case was 5, I've got a couple of 7. So I think the truth is that in trying to deal with this, there in some companies over-egg the pudding. And again, as Will Jennings has pointed out to you, there is a correlation between the degree of error in the polls and the extent to which they tried to model the prior turnout. The other thing that we should say, I think it's long been in the public domain, and again, which again makes us know that the problem in 2017 is different from 2015. In 2015, the most important graph in the report for which your special advisor was responsible was the one that said, well, actually, on average, the final polls said, whatever it was, Conservative 38, Labour 38. If you just take the unweighted data and all the opinion polls, it's Conservative 38, Labour 38. So all of the weighting and filtering, etc., that was done by the polls in 2015 basically ended them back where they were. In 2017, the picture is very, very different. If you take the average of the unweighted data, now this is including no demographic dating, by the way, on average it's a Conservative lead of 1 point. Okay? So the truth is that this time the weighting and the filtering, etc., drove a number of companies out of the way. And you could basically interpret the unweighted data in 2017 as being, pretty much par for the course. Slight tendency to underestimate the Conservative position relative to Labour, but actually, reasonably okay. But the truth is that the various attempts at weighting and filtering, in part trying to say, hang on, we think our samples are wrong, they're overestimating the younger people who are going to turn out and vote, and a variety of other things. They ended up actually overcorrecting. If they just simply corrected, they might have got themselves much closer to that.
I think it's fair to say that was also the case in the Brexit referendum as well. It was a similar experience. Many of the unweighted samples actually performed better than the adjusted final numbers.
How
if you
interesting.
like.
The Brexit referendum is about halfway. If you take the average of the unweighted data in the Brexit referendum, it's literally 50-50. So insofar as the average of the final polls was 52-48, half the error is to do with sampling and half the error is to do with weighting. And certainly, one of the things, again, coming back to your initial question about the challenges, what the EU referendum was difficult, not just because of education, but you were trying to estimate something which, leaving aside the 1975 referendum, nobody had attempted to estimate before. Whatever its ills, the polling industry just tried to learn from its past mistakes. There wasn't a past to deal with. And certainly, one of the things that marked polling in the 2016 referendum was repeated developments, amendments to methodology, all of which were in the public domain, all of which, because the BPC rules, the pollsters had to be open up about. But it so happens to be true that many more of those changes were changes that it was said was pushing Remain up and in the opposite direction. And, you know, again, in a personal capacity, I wrote a blog on polling day and said, well, actually, you strip out all the changes, there's been a 5% swing to leave during the course of the EU referendum campaign. So, you know, again, certainly, you know, this again, you know, as undoubtedly the polls are saying, you know, we absolutely here need to make sure we are being as right as we can be. This is a crucial call, etc., etc. But some, not necessarily all, but some of the attempts they made in that direction perhaps led them astray. But, you know, hindsight's wonderful.
Well, exactly as I said, yeah.
Pippa.
Just a couple of points and a question. You quite rightly focus on the fact that, the polls are perhaps less accurate at the point of view of the first past the poll, but nevertheless have a broad set of interesting data that would have been useful if people had concentrated on that. The problem we have, I suppose, is not so much the polls themselves, but the way the media report it. And of course, they're fascinated by first past the post because it sells papers, etc. So inevitably, I think that, you know, we have to focus on that aspect of it because that's what is going to be reported. And the thing that I'm interested in is that when we spoke to some of the polling companies, they talked about the way they adjusted their data, you know, for turnout, etc., as we've been discussing. But there was also an element in there of human judgment on sort of sense checking it. And, you know, if a result came out that, look, it can't be quite right, there was a sort of sense checking of it, which is very difficult to sort of quantify. I particularly as probably the people making those judgments got their sense from probably broadcast and print media rather than the social media, which reflected perhaps what the young were thinking. And they, you know, a broader picture, if they managed to have all, might have been a better sense check. I just was wondering, what is the BPC's view on that, since it can't be quantified or spelt out transparently before the poll starts, which would be a sort of a better way of doing it. It's just a sort of finger in the air judgment at the end.
Well, the strict answer to your question is that now, and this is again one of the things that was the consequence of the Sturgis report, is that if any company changes in any way the way it has collected or estimated its voting intention data during the course of an election or referendum campaign, it has to make that public. And so the reason why I was able to say earlier, look, there were lots and lots of methodological changes during the EU referendum, is because the companies were saying, we've made this change, we've made this change, we've made this change. During the 2017 election, I mean, a lot of the companies made changes between 2015 and 2017, and BPC did actually hold, together with the National Centre for Research Methods, a conference at the British Academy during the middle of the election campaign in which we issued a report and laid out the details of how the companies had changed their methods. Some companies routinely do their final poll slightly differently, and they tell us that. I mean, Simon may be able to correct me. My impression is there wasn't a great deal of change to the methods that the companies were pursuing once the election campaign had kicked off, partly because, like all of us who were involved in this election, you know, we're on autopilot. We haven't got time to think, you know, we weren't expecting this to happen. So I think, so the first thing to say is that, you know, it may have been true in the past. I will say no more than that, you know, before the days of the transparency of the BPC, yes, a polling company could look at the data and say, you know what, we really are short on 18 to 24-year-olds, or those data for the C2s really do look rather at odds with everything else we have seen, therefore, you know, we need to tweak it in this way. Well, if they're going to tweak now, they have to tell us, okay, and therefore you can tell and you can judge as to whether or not it's right. I mean, there's a second, I think, slightly wider question what you're saying, which is, are opinion pollsters necessarily immune from the zeitgeist in which they live? Okay? All right? And let me just say no more than this. I think certainly, given that most of, not all, but many of the changes that were made to polling methodology in the EU referendum tended to push the polls in a more Remain direction, was there a risk that an industry that is middle class and London-based, and where the zeitgeist was, of course, surely nobody's going to be daft enough as to vote to leave the European Union, Whether or not the industry was caught in a, well, if we really are going to call this for leave, we absolutely have to be sure this is right, because otherwise the rest of the London professional middle, if we call it for leave, the London professional middle classes, including probably awful lot of people who occupy this building, really will crucify us. Now that's a hypothesis on my part, but certainly you can certainly there's a zeitgeist. Of course, there was a wide zeitgeist at the beginning of the election campaign that Theresa May was going to walk it. I have to say personally I wasn't of that opinion, but that's another matter. But the truth is, I don't think that in the case of the 2017 election, the decisions that were made about how to weight and filter the data were largely made between 2015 and 2017, before the election was called. The only consequence of the election being called when it was, is that everybody was in a sense caught in midstream, having changed their methods, most cases not more than 12 months beforehand, but hadn't necessarily had a great deal of opportunity to test them out, and et cetera, et cetera. But once the election was called, I mean, literally, if you were involved in any kind of polling exercise, it's, well, we've made, for good or ill, we've made the decisions we've made.
Yeah. Just following up on that, the transparency point is a good one, that people, if they change their methodology, they have to tell you. The difficulty for the broader general public is that they don't tend to follow what the BPC has been told. They tend to follow what's in the press and the reporting, so that they won't know that the methodology has changed, which may have caused a bit of swing.
Well, they may or may not. I mean, the truth is that, again, transparency, I mean, internet's facilitated transparency. I mean, it means, we basically operate on the fact.
You have to be pretty interested in politics.
Well, you're right. I mean, but, there are some of us out there. I mean, I run a couple of websites. Anthony Wells runs a website, and there are various other people who run websites, in which we are sufficiently anarchy, in which we kind of do go into these things and we do try to explain them to people.
No, my issue is that there's a tiny percentage of the voting population that actually bother to do that. Most people, unfortunately, and maybe there's an education job that needs to be done, take everything on face value. So I do think, and it may be in the reporting that we need to be looking at, but I do think there is an issue in this, and transparency only goes part way.
I think the answer to is it will vary by journalist and newspaper. All right. Some journal, I mean, certainly if a polling company is polling regularly for a newspaper, doing a referendum or election campaign, and they decide to change their methods, well, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think 99 times out of 100, they will advise the client that is what they have done, and they may well be quite keen for the client, at least somewhere in the text, to say, actually, this is what has been done. But sure, as with the reporting of any aspect of politics, of course, the headlines, tend to get, the top level, and the fine detail, you have to get. But political polling is not unique in that respect.
It is an issue.
And I think I know you talked earlier in an earlier session around the '92 election, and I guess one of the big distinctions there is at that time the reporting of an opinion poll might be just as John described, and if I can call it top down, perhaps, because it was in the newspaper, and let's say the journalist had done the job well, it had explained any changes or any backgrounds to the poll that the reader needed to understand, and there'd been some nice work perhaps on some of the graphics, which I think can really help explain to people what's going on. And I guess, of course, the biggest changes we've been talking just this morning is around, one of the big changes is around the internet, whether it's in terms of the methodology and in terms of the dissemination, and I suppose there clearly are pros and cons of that. One of the pros is there's actually a lot of commentary that if you're interested you can go into, and perhaps one of the cons may be some of the commentary may not be quite as well informed and as perhaps some people might think. So, I mean, that clearly is a big distinction, I think, is that now the poll is released, in the recent election, control is lost almost completely, and that wasn't perhaps the case 25 years ago.
Okay. My batting order is Alan, Nora, Barbara.
Professor Curtis, you said that polling had got more difficult, and you explained that response rates are lower, but also that it's harder these days to get a handle on class in Britain, that we have to look rather more at education, that education is a slippery concept, and so forth. But isn't it the case that society is always changing?
Sure.
And that polling has always been trying to hit a moving target, and polling has always been a little bit vulnerable to the trap of extrapolating too much from from the previous election or fighting the last war. And the polling involves judgments which are difficult to make and maybe wrong. Would it be fair to say that polling is really an art masquerading as a science, and that the public's expectations of polling are perhaps excessive in that they think that the polls are objective and authoritative, and actually they're made up very significantly in terms of judgment that is as fallible as anybody else's judgment?
Yes, and I think you could probably apply that speech to any macroeconomic forecasting as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, perhaps, thank goodness, human beings are unpredictable. Social sciences attempt to identify, of which this is a kind of small part, attempt to be able to try to identify the forces that influence behaviour, with what impact, etc., etc. But sure, human beings don't always do what you expect them to do. And B, yes, there are lots of judgments made during the whole course of the survey process about exactly how best to do it. It's not just uninformed judgment. You know, there is a whole literature out there about how surveys and polls should be done, and we do try to learn from experiments, etc., etc. So it's not an uninformed judgment, but like everything else in life, it's not a perfectly informed judgment.
And I think one of the things that's not new is this difference perhaps between what a poll says and, let's say, what the commentator, what the pollster, perhaps in the old days, and now what the pollster and the blogger or whoever else is commentating on says. And it's not a new debate, but it's certainly been evident looking at people, looking at reviews of the recent elections in Britain and around the world, is this question of whether more can and should be done to express perhaps the difference between this is what it's saying, but actually the answer could be within these ranges, and actually we're not too sure because it's very fluid. And of course the answer that some might give, perhaps some pollsters might give, is that the media won't like it if we have, you know, a kind of a line with lots of sort of wiggly things around it that means basically we don't know. And so that naturally, I think, as we were discussing this morning, the focus gets onto the most high-profile issue, which is the if you like, the voting intention questions as they go through the campaign, particularly in the final stage. But I think there is when more gets onto the issue of perhaps not so much about transparency around communications and how to communicate it. I think it's not a new one, but this is one that I think we are seeing people having to think about some more in the new context, which is this difference between, if you like, what is the poll saying and what it might mean. Is probably, I think, to John's opening point about how perhaps if polling is getting more difficult, I think that question is getting more difficult to answer, if not to ask.
Would you like to see people better educated to understand the polls, for example, in citizenship education in schools or wherever? Would that be useful for our democracy?
Well, if we improve the mathematical and statistical literacy of our population, I think it would improve a lot of things. Opinion polling probably wouldn't be the top of most people's list, but it might prove to be a beneficiary.
Okay, we go. Nora, Barbara, Robert, Kate, and then I might, if I may, switch the emphasis to a little while to regulation, what regulation exists and whether it should be stronger. Is that all right with everybody? Okay. Thank you very much, Nora.
I wanted to ask a bit about the industry and membership of the British Polling Council. We have in our brief polling companies that are not members. Are they different in some way? What's distinctive about them?
You'll have to tell me what's in your brief in a moment, but...
there was a gap there. That's what I'm asking about.
Okay. I am aware of only 2 organisations that have, in the last 10 years, that are based inside the United Kingdom, who are not members of the British Polling Council. One is Lord Ashcroft, which is a one-man band. The other, which actually it's a British branch of an American organisation, is Greenberg, Quinlan, Rossler. As it happens, Both of them, in practice, adhere to the transparency rules of the British Polling Council. That does therefore mean that I think the gap that exists is if companies that are based outside the UK are asked to do opinion polling, which happens occasionally. For example, Tony Blair's Institute recently used one. They are not under any obligation to do so, and because in the US there isn't the same culture of transparency as there is here, they do not routinely, although they may sometimes, make the kinds of detail available that any UK company will base. So, I mean, I stand to be corrected, but I'm not aware of any significant player in a significant UK-based player in the polling industry, which is either not a member of the BPC or is not in practice following the BPC's rules.
But Lord Ashcroft's polling is outside.
Lord Ashcroft's polling is outside, but he follows the rules because it's all up on his website. Greenberg, Quinn and Rosner are not members, but they put their polls up on their website.
And I see you have the power to expel members or suspend them.
Yeah.
Have you ever had to do so?
Nope. I would suggest to you that one of the reasons why why the British Polling Council works is that we have very rarely had to enforce the rules. We've only on one occasion, actually, just to briefly recap, we have essentially a two-stage process. Stage one is if there is a complaint, the three officers, Simon, myself and Nick Moo, adjudicate, and we have on 4 occasions said, hang on, this is not right, the company should be releasing information, it's not released. Only once, and this was before my time as president, has that officer's ruling been challenged, and it went then to the second stage, which is an independent committee of disclosure. As it happens, I know, because I was then a member of the relevant committee of disclosure, the problem actually was not with the polling company directly, it was the reluctance of the commissioner to allow the data to be put in the public domain. But eventually, a BPC ruling meant in the end the commissioner had to back down. So one of the things that the BPC rules do, as well as trying to make pollsters into honest men and women, is that it also helps to make commissioners honest men and women, and particularly, of course, when it comes to situations whereby parts of private polls may have been leaked, when we have some pretty clear rules that, and if you've leaked it, it's therefore in the public domain, therefore the transparency rules apply. And if, by the way, you've cherry-picked the findings, the whole lot has to go out into the public domain. So it also acts as a bulwark against what we might regard as sharp practice by commissioners, as well as by the polling companies themselves.
And in addition to the polling industry, there is a much broader range of organisations that conduct surveys, isn't there? Can you comment at all on the relative size of the polling industry, as you've used the phrase, and the broader range of organisations that do surveys?
Do you want to answer that?
Yes. So in the UK, the main body of reference, if you like, is the Market Research Society, which has been in existence for more than 60 years, and that is a body which covers the whole range of market research that's conducted, including for the things we buy, the products we consume, government and private sector, and it's, if you like, a classic professional body, a little bit like you might have in the medical sphere, in the sense that it covers professional standards in terms of how do you, for example, conduct the research. There are obligations around things around sampling and questionnaire design, and actually also around transparency and release. And the focus, I think, is particularly on good practice by the respondents, and also actually on the sort of obligations of sort of, if you like, clients and agencies. And so there are actually things around transparency in, for example, the Market Research Society Code of Conduct. I think what's fair to say is that the British Polling Council rules, when they were set up, I think really go further, for example, in terms of speed, and also in terms of the level of detail, in terms of what's expected if you are engaged in this practice of opinion polling, which, to your opening question, is a very, very small sliver of the wider market research industry.
Can I add to that? So there's then another whole community that's engaged in attitudinal research, including attitudinal politics research, which is essentially the social research community, which is professionally organised through the Social Research Association. So in that sense, social research, which I'm very heavily involved with and does the British Social Attitude Survey, it takes its professional guidance and ethics from that organisation. And again, you know, it has an ethical standards. And of course, what's also true is insofar as you are doing work for grant bodies such as the Economic and Social Research Council or the Nuffield Foundation, they also have that ethical standards which you have to be able to meet. So there are a range of bodies, depending on exactly the funding stream and the character of the work, that deal with the side, as it were, the ethics of the conduct of surveys and polls. The BPC is primarily focused on the issue of you tell us what you've done, so that anybody who wishes to do so can form their own judgment about the merits or otherwise of what you've done. But that's an area where the Social Research Association and the Market Research Society effectively don't really cover.
Can you give us a sort of order of magnitude view of the proportion of the spend that goes into each of these, into the polling, the market research and the attitudinal surveys?
This is if you're talking about opinion polling versus, let's say, the market research industry as a body, you are talking significantly under 5% and probably under 2%. I haven't got the exact numbers to hand, but it's always been a very small proportion of the broader research that's done, let's say, in the commercial sector. And actually, to John's point around perhaps some of the social research that's done internationally, in terms of the spend, there's much more spent, I think, on many of the international studies that are done and governed by organisations, codes like WAPOR and indeed SMR. So it's always been a very particular enterprise, and I guess, as John says, that's why there's a very specific remit around the British Polling Council, around the organisations that produce and publish opinion polls.
Thank you very much. And then just as a maverick last question, do you find any bodies that use as one of their, particularly any polling members of the polling industry, who consider or separate out whether people do or do not use social media or indeed other digital media?
British Social Attitudes has, in the last year or two, collected data on whether or not you have a Twitter handle or not. I think the British Election Study's done the same. I've not seen a great deal of written research coming out of this, but your specialist advisor may be able to advise on that. I mean, more broadly speaking, what do we know from certainly some of the stuff that's been published about activity on social media? Yes voters in the Scottish independence referendum were much more active than no voters. Labour voters tend to be more active than Conservative voters. And I think, if I'm right, Leave voters were more active than Remain voters, but I may not be entirely...
and everybody's talking to each other.
Yes, and the crucial thing to know also about social media is that, for the most part, it's the sheep talk to the sheep and the dogs talk to the dogs. In other words, most people tend to follow people of the same mind of themselves. It becomes a force potentially for mobilisation, probably not for persuasion. The links across people of different views are relatively weak.
Yeah. Last question. And presumably the social media correlation with Leave and Labour voters also is a correlation with age.
Yeah, sure, in part, yes.
I mean,
but not entirely. But yeah, sure, no, exactly. Yeah.
Barbara.
Thank you, yes. We heard from different things from different witnesses about the issue of regional variations, and you mentioned the earlier about the, if you like, the sort of ubiquity of the London-based kind of what one of my colleagues might call the chattering classes, or that kind of subculture. I just wondered how well you felt the regional variations had been taken account of. I know we had an earlier, I've forgotten his name, they'd probably be able to tell me, somebody from Bristol University who was researching constituency. Yeah, constituency.
Johnson, yeah.
I just wondered how well you felt this had been covered and whether this is something that we needed to look a bit more closely at.
Well, point one, of course, is most of the opinion polling of which people take notice is GB-wide. And insofar as it's trying to come up with estimates of population parameters, it's doing so GB-wide. Now, to achieve that objective, you obviously are concerned to ensure that, amongst other things, your sample is representative by region. So that's point one. Point two, if you looked at the details of the polls during the 2017 election, it was perfectly clear that the Labour Party was going to do relatively well in London, and that predates the Corbyn surge. It was clear that the Conservative Party was going to do relatively well in the north of England, particularly in Leave voting areas. That information was there in the polls if you were willing to go through it. And indeed, those patterns were quite important to being able to justify the expectation early on that there might be a landslide for the Conservatives, because they needed that kind of differential geography for the electoral system to work to their advantage. So, yes, the information is there. Now, obviously, Scotland and Wales have their own particular interests. I suppose one of the interesting, fascinating stories about Wales was how early on in the campaign we had these very strong pro-Conservative figures, and then it all swung back towards the Labour Party. In the case of Scotland, you know, because the truth is there, the political system is very, very different. The polls pretty much, once again, got it roughly right. They told you that the SNP were losing an awful lot of votes. They told you the Conservative Party was probably going to come second, and they also told you towards the end of the campaign that the Labour Party had engaged in a degree of recovery. So that's roughly right. The most important exercise, I mean, the innovative exercise is about not so much regional variation, but constituency variation, were two attempts, one done for Lord Ashcroft and one done for YouGov, in which, you know, you're not just looking at a sample of 1,000 or 2,000 people, which, you know, on its own is never enough to get at regional variation, but taking very large numbers, like 50,000 respondents, using that to really seriously model the probability of people with certain characteristics being likely to vote Conservative, Labour or whatever, working out how many people with those characteristics live in each constituency using administrative data, and then using that to model the outcome. Now, in the case of YouGov, it worked very well. That's where the forecast of Conservatives 304 seats came from, and that was very much taking into account the geographical variation. And given that they had a 4-point lead in their national vote share, their modelling was clearly quite important. In the case of Lord Ashcroft, it didn't help him out. So the truth is that, yes, the regional dimension matters. Are you going to get it right? But you're only going to get it right if the underlying polling data are at least reasonably accurate.
Mm-hmm. Can I think, you just mentioned again, if you're looking at it by constituency, for example, the people that press are calling the left behind, I wonder whether how well they were really represented. I mean, and if you look at some of the areas that in the referendum, for example, that vote Leave, they were areas that were less densely populated, a lot of them. Some of them even quite peripheral, and just wondered whether this is a dimension that perhaps, you know, was not fully...
Well, the answer to you is that Leave voters, other things being equal, tend to be less interested in politics. Mm-hmm. And to that extent, at least, it comes back to the earlier part of our conversation, which is that there's therefore a greater probability that they won't appear in surveys. Whether or not that translates, I mean, one thing we have to bear in mind here is we don't as yet have any of the high quality estimates of turnout from random probability face-to-face surveys. But they will give us a further, I mean, such evidence as I have seen leads me to suspect that in the 2017 election, some of those Leave voters who turned out in the EU referendum, who didn't turn out in 2015, didn't turn out in 2017. In contrast, some of those Remain inclined voters who didn't vote in 2016 did turn out in 2017. But I have to say that at the moment is a hypothesis with there's some evidence rather than something that's been fully nailed down. So to that extent at least, the Leave behind were perhaps more of a problem in 2016 than in 2017.
And then just really to pursue it, that if these are the people who are so-called left behind, etc., is there something in the idea that the way we carry out these investigations and research projects is, you were saying they're less politically active, well maybe it's more difficult to get to the bottom of that.
Yeah,
but then they are a factor that needs to be considered.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, you know, surprise, surprise. If somebody rings you up or sends you an email saying, oh, by the way, I've got this wonderful survey about what's going on in politics. Well, outside the confines of this building, you know what a lot of people say, sorry, just not interested. And inevitably, therefore, that's
even within this building.
Even within this building, right, okay. Yes, well, okay. And in fact, one of the things that's true is, for example, British Social Attitudes, which is, you know, in some senses an omnibus survey, it has lots of questions about lots of things. You know, we'll ask questions about assisted dying or grandmothers or education or whatever, alongside some questions about politics. And one of the things you tend to find with that is that that's somewhat more successful, not wholly successful, somewhat more successful at getting the politically disengaged than those who than surveys that are wholly about politics, right? Because the interviewer can sell the survey about, oh look, you know, you've got, you know, you've got your lovely grandchildren with you, or look, you know, we've got these questions about grandparents, and then they kind of grit their teeth as they answer the questions about politics. So that does therefore mean, I mean, occasionally, sometimes journalists turn their nose up when some polling may be done as part of an omnibus survey in which you've also asked questions about DAS and OMO or whatever. Well, actually, maybe people are more interested in DAS and OMO than they are in politics, and therefore, as a result, you help to overcome some of this problem that people are motivated to participate in the survey, or their motivation is affected by the subject matter of the survey.
Okay, but does it still seem to you that if with the margin of error in the referendum particularly, we are not managing to take account of these people, and that perhaps we ought to be thinking of other ways of getting that information? It's perhaps still a challenge to
don't push it too hard. I mean, I think on the best estimates of the data I've seen so far, maybe the differential turnout was worth 1% of the vote to Leave, but not more than that. So therefore probably was not crucial to the outcome.
Robert?
Can I just clarify, first of all, early on in your comments, I think you said that the majority of opinion polls showed a Leave majority in terms of the...
the ones during the campaign. Take all the polls during the campaign.
But is it not correct that actually the majority of the last polls of each of the different companies actually showed a majority to Remain?
Correct, including one famous poll done by the organisation that was advising the Prime Minister during the course of the EU referendum.
Because you see, this is what worries me. You identified a series of different statistics at different points, saying, well, actually, if you looked at lots of data in relation to 2017, we got it right. But the reality is that everybody believes, whether it's the Messenger or whether it's the pollsters, that they got it wrong in 2017, 2016, 2015, etc. And it's rather like saying an English batsman, well, I faced 50 balls and I only made one error. Unfortunately, it was the one that I snicked to the first slip. And that, I'm afraid, is what it sounds in part one's been listening to in terms of an analysis of the last three major polling events in this country. Can I move on to an area we've not touched on?
Well, can you in fairness allow me to respond to your point before going on to your question?
I thought you might want to.
I mean, look, I take your point. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's entirely reasonable to say, what are the final polls? How close are they? And, that is a tough test for any survey exercise to take, but you're quite reasonable to do it. But, I mean, I would suggest to you that a situation where, 4 out of 6 polls had Remain ahead and 2 had Leave ahead, You know, one's judgment of what is the meaning of that should be informed by what they were saying in the week or 2 or 3 beforehand, because it may just be that at the end of the day, given we were talking about a very, very close 50-50 result, it may just be that random sampling error in the polls in the last week led them astray, whereas the previous week they happened to be spot on. Now, we don't know, but I think it's reasonable to suggest to you that, in terms of what were the polls telling us about what the outcome would be, to sit entirely myopically looking at just the final polls and ignoring everything else probably isn't the most intelligent way of reading them. But it's perfectly reasonable to regard as the test of how accurate is the stuff at the end of the yes, how close are the final polls, and are they randomly distributed around the true value? Answer in all 3 cases, the answer to that question is no. And that, you're absolutely right.
Can I move on to an area you just touched on, which is the question of social issues and polling, rather than political polling? But social issues are in effect political polls in one form or another.
Sure.
They're trying to persuade a government or an administration to adopt one view or one policy as against another. Do polls conducted for organisations that are pursuing particular social issues, certain policy issues, do they throw up different issues from those in relation to political parties? And if so, what? And how do the polling organisations actually tackle them?
I'll let you answer that first.
I think in a way the way they do throw up some different issues, because then in a poll on a social issue, you're moving quite quickly to a question around survey design, and perhaps in particular questionnaire design. Let's just say it's a general public poll of the national population that you're doing. So I think in that sense it takes you on to your previous thing, perhaps a slightly different wicket, a related one, because then the questions, I think, do come into issues of professional, if you like, practice, if you like, and you're expecting the pollster, if they're designing the questionnaire, to have done that in a professional manner, that the questions are balanced. I would say the more questions there are, the more that is helpful to anybody consuming them, because you get more of a rounded picture rather than when it's just 1 or 2. So in that sense, I think it takes you onto a different area. Coming back to, I guess, the pollsters and the British Polling Council, certainly the aspiration is that the British Polling Council rules will also apply in those circumstances, and indeed the rules of transparency should hopefully be very helpful there, because people still have to put up those questions, and if people have views on them, or views on the design of the poll, or on the way it's been interpreted, it is there in the public domain for people to comment on. And to the point John previously mentioned, if clients will not release them, then there is a problem, and then that will follow the process through. So I think it's clearly a related area, but it's certainly an area that one would hope that the transparency rules and the rules on disclosure and on good practice that the Polling Council has been working on will contribute in that domain.
I mean, I think the answer to you is I think the honest answer is that this is a bit of a negotiated relationship. Though I don't think, I think this is just as true of political polling, okay? I mean, what makes you think that political parties, particularly if they think they might want to publish this, are not going to choose topics and perhaps argue for question wordings that actually, from their perspective, I mean, one of the things you discover about clients who are commissioning polling work, they will give you a question wording and they'll think, well, of course that's what you're going to ask, because they don't think it's biased because of their perspective. And you kind of gradually have to kind of say to them, look, hang on, that actually, you can't assume that everybody views the world through the prism that you view it through. But, sorry, political parties are full of people who view the world through a particular prism, and therefore that would be a negotiated relationship. Newspapers, of course, have a gender, and may well. Now, the truth is, it probably, at the end of the day, any organisation that's doing polling or survey work at some point will say, look, I'm not willing to do this, all right? But at the point at which you put your foot down and say that, it's obviously, again, it's a matter of judgment. Of course, what certainly is true is, rather more subtle, is the question of agenda selection. Okay, what do you decide to focus on? And there, undoubtedly, whether it's a political party, a newspaper, a campaigning organisation, or in truth, the state, because government departments aren't immune from this either, the question of agenda selection. Of course, at the end of the day, people want surveys about the subjects in which they're interested in or think are going to be in their interest. And certainly a polling company can't say, well, look, I know you want to do a survey about the position of people's attitudes towards the homeless, but actually I think you should be doing a survey about landlords. Right? I mean, there's a limit to what you can do here.
Can I give you, just as a conclusion...
I am getting nervous because we do need to give John a chance to answer on regulation.
That's fine. I'll leave it.
So could you leave it there and just to finish off this bit, Kate?
Well, I was actually going to ask something more regulation.
Well, that would be a great way of starting. Thank you.
So why don't we sort of go on to that? I love the way you compared polling to macroeconomic forecasting, but when you cut some of those very high-profile forecasts, for example, in the budget, they're often not proven correct later or indeed at the time. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things this committee has looked at over the past few weeks is just particularly coming into the election when it's all so high profile and it does, whatever happens, affect the climate in which the election is run and the way the news is at least sort of put together in the evening. Are we doing enough? Are we proactive enough about setting a sort of gold standard for what is a good poll? I know you have your rules, but do you feel that as in your position or otherwise, that we adjudicate this sort of thing in a proactive way or as effectively as we should do?
Well, I mean, there is undoubtedly one constraint to what the British Polling Council can do. This is not an organisation with thousands of pounds of resources. It has a few thousand quid. And one of the simple reasons why we as a council are not in a position to say this poll is good, this poll is bad, is that we cannot afford to fight a court case brought by a company that says it's bad. Okay? I, as an individual, quite often provide advice to journalists saying, well, actually, there's a bit of an issue here or whatever, and they may or may not take that advice. Certainly, unless you are a very rich, extremely well-endowed organisation in a position to fight in the courts, you cannot really have an organisation that kind of says, this is rubbish. And the sanction that we have, in terms of the rules that we do have, is expulsion. Now, I will simply point out to you that in the case of the PCRA recently, the expulsion of a member basically helped to ensure that that company went bankrupt. And I think certainly the moral suasion that we have as an organisation is potentially pretty high. If you want to go beyond, then you have to decide, well, who are the great and good and wise people who are able to say definitively, this is good, this is bad. I certainly wouldn't want to take on that job. I may occasionally say to people, well, look, I think, well, there's an issue here, or there's a debate here, or, look at these numbers, hang on, they don't look as though they've got enough young people, etc., etc. I think, as with all research, including macro, the Treasury, the OBR has competitors. National Institute for Economic and Social Research, the Bank of England. We have a plethora of economic forecasts, and therefore we can engage in an analysis as to what the different assumptions they're making, etc., etc. We equally have a plethora of polling companies, no two of whom do the job exactly the same way, which at various points in time, some of them get more or less criticism. To that extent, at least, you're relying on competition and public exposure as the best form of regulation. Together with, of course, at the end of the day, if the companies get it wrong, right, I mean, the criticism is fairly rapidly heaped upon them, not unreasonably.
Curious enough, it's hard to see that any company particularly suffered from getting the 2017 election wrong. If I could follow on from where Kate got us to, I mean, any organisations. Sorry, I should first say we are taking evidence from the MRS, the other regulator, next week. So I'm going to ask you now, put on firmly your BPC hat and ignore your other hats as professor and the world's a leading expert on polls and so on. BPC. Okay.
Sure.
Any organisation such as the BPC, where in three results in a row were, shall I say, suboptimal, would be wanting to reconsider its position as an organisation in terms of regulation. You've given already one powerful argument why you might not want to go further. But are you really confident that in the situation we're in, and where the polling industry is, confidence in the polling industry among the political classes is not terribly high, are you really so confident that regulation as we have it, namely transparency, is enough?
Short answer, no, and of course that's not the position the BPC has adopted. The decision I made in 2015 that BPC together with MRS should instigate an independent inquiry de facto widened what the BPC was about. I mean, strictly speaking, basically BPC has two parts. One is transparency, the other is improving public understanding. Now, in a sense, we could justify what we did on the public understanding, but in practice, the BPC in 2015 took on a degree of responsibility for the collective health of the methodology of the industry. That was followed up in 2016 by a seminar which still needs to be written up, but the election overtook us. And a similar exercise is now going in 2017. It's a different exercise this time partly because not all of the industry got it wrong in 2017, and partly because the truth is that in 2015 we persuaded a lot of very kind people to give an awful lot of time for free to go through what the polls did. I felt that this time around we should try a different model. But yes, all the polling companies, by I think it's 15th of December, have to send me a report, and there's some specific questions in what they've been asked to do, particularly about weighting and filtering, to say what they did, what their evaluation, etc. is, and we will be publishing, you'll be holding a seminar, probably now in February, and we'll be holding a report. So the answer to you is, in practice, although it's not regulation in the sense of thou must do this, it is, I suppose, taking on a responsibility for ensuring that there is self-reflection and a concern about the collective health of the methodology of the industry. So that role has in effect been taken on, and it does certainly mean, to be honest, before 2015, the BPC effectively ran almost on autopilot. We would get a few complaints a year, most of which weren't valid, and there wasn't a great deal to do. I mean, in the last 2 years. So the answer to that's the way in which we've approached it. We can't go around saying this is right, this is wrong. What we can do is to ensure that the industry collectively is concerned about its methodological health, and I envisage us carrying on. Well, we are going to carry on with that role in the new year.
That's very helpful. But in France, the Commission des Sondages doesn't prescribe what methods people may use, except in certain aspects of what they must say when they publish their polls. But they do provide a measure of methodological guidance and clearance of questions that are being asked, so they go beyond where you are at the moment. And I know, for example, that Lord Fuchs, who introduced a regulation bill, as you know, in the last Parliament, has been very struck by that model. How big is the difference between them and you? And you entirely rule out that some bodies such as the Commission des Sondages should be founded here?
Well, I think you should talk to in the next session to colleagues about this, because I know they have been talking to their colleagues in France. In the meantime, let me ask you this. If we take, for example, the way in which the exit poll is now currently conducted, which, for example, makes no claim at all to be engaged in interviewing a representative sample. When the current methodology was first used in 2015, we could give you the statistical argument, but it hadn't been tried before. Would a comité d'un sondage at that point said, oh, that's fine, go away and experiment? Or would it have said, actually, no, we think that's far too risky? With the benefit of hindsight, if they said it was too risky, they would have made the wrong decision. Would if YouGov had gone to a comité des sondages and said, look, there's a couple of bright academics at the LSE who've developed this new method for analysing opinion polls in order to estimate what's going to happen in each and every constituency. It's a new method. They've done various tests on kind of previous work, but it hasn't been done before. Would the Comité des Sondages say yes or no? But actually, one of the successes of the 2017 election was one of the exercises using that methodology. In other words, and equally, let us also say that in the wake of the 2015 election, the Comité des Sondages said, you know what, actually, you really, all of you, need to do something right about the fact that you're not estimating the turnout differential correctly, and you need to do this modelling. And therefore, as a result, Survation, who were the one company who got it pretty much right, and who used exactly the same method as they did in 2015, would have been told, no, you can't do it that way. I think we should be wary of assuming that the collective consensus, what I suggest to you a Comité des Sondages is likely to embrace, is necessarily proving to be the right path down which to go.
Yes, but I mean, there are balances in all these things. I was a financial regulator at one point, and sometimes by interfering and regulating too much, you prevented innovation that would have been good for customers, and sometimes you prevented innovation that led to the ripping off of customers. What I'm trying to establish is where the precise balance in the case of the BPC lies, because the fact is, so long as the companies who belong to you are transparent, there is nothing you can criticise them for. They can have any wild method they want. It can be a consensus among experts that it's not very good, but if they wish to practice it, and as long as they're transparent, you can do nothing.
We as an organisation can, but we provide the means for, collectively, for the rest of the world to say, no, this is wrong. I mean, I well remember back in 1983, was it audience selection as they then were, who engaged in an early attempt to introduce telephone polls in this country, whose polls were coming up with much higher results for the then Liberal SDP alliance than anybody else. And what they were doing was quite widely criticised at the time, and people said, hang on, not quite sure that we should be doing this. But that was the product of professional and journalistic discussion of what they were doing and the apparent weaknesses of the methodology that they were using. But you have to decide whether or not you think civil society. I mean, the other side of this, I guess, let's get to the point here. Is, arguably, I mean, we have to ask ourselves what is the downside risk of the polls getting it wrong? Okay. Now, I guess the downside risk is that you may feel that the way in which an election campaign is framed incorrectly. But let's go back, for example, to the example where this is most often quoted, which is 2015. Let's say that in 2015, on average, the opinion polls were correct, and that includes, because this was crucial to the outcome in 2015, people accepting, because lots of people didn't accept, that as a result the Liberal Democrats were going to get crucified. All right. Now, given that a 7-point lead gave you a majority of 12, all right, you would have got quite a few opinion polls that said all the leads only 2, 3, 4, just simply because of random sampling error around that average. Okay, so we would still have had speculation about, well, if indeed it is only a 2 or 3 or 4 point lead, will Ed Miliband do a deal with the SNP or not? All right. So even in that famous example, the truth is, if the polls were accurate, we would still have been discussing what would have happened in the event of a hung parliament, because around a half of the polls would probably have been pointing to some kind of hung parliament. All right. Second thing we have to ask ourselves, what is the evidence out there about the public being influenced? Well, again, if you go back to the 2015 election, there isn't a great deal of evidence about what was the impact of the fact that the election got framed as a, will Labour do a deal with the SNP? But such evidence as we have does not substantiate the proposition that this changed the views of voters. And more broadly, I would point you to the evidence in the Waypor submission, particularly the reference to the work by Ian McAllister, which is the most elaborate work on UK polling impact, is that basically for every occasion where you can find a bandwagon effect, you can find another occasion where there's an underdog effect. And it's not clear that opinion polls have any dramatic impact on the overall outcome of general elections in any consistent fashion. So I think, think about here, what is the downside risk? Certainly I would suggest to you the downside risk of inaccurate opinion polls is probably a lot rather less than the downside risk of inaccurate macroeconomic forecasting.
Well, the downside risk, I mean, if you took the Scottish referendum, for example, the Scots were given a new bonus package in order to stop them doing what polls said they were trying to do. That seems a pretty big downside.
No, not at all. No. Let's get the Scottish independence referendum right. There were only 2 opinion polls that ever put the yes side ahead. One of which was basically self-criticised by the own polling company, saying we are seriously doubtful about this and we don't think that it was right. On the day that the famous YouGov poll that came up with, which was, 51% for yes, there was another opinion poll by panel base who had been saying it's about 47 or 48% for the yes side ever since the referendum campaign started, and they still said on exactly the same day it's 48%. But the truth is, everybody decided to ignore the polling company that says that nothing has changed, and took far too much notice of, given how close that referendum was, it's not surprising that one opinion poll amongst the whole lot of them would come up with yes ahead. That was almost statistically guaranteed. But, the truth is people decided to believe YouGov and put their faith in it and decided to ignore everybody else. That's a judgment for them to make, but I don't think it was a reasonable collective judgment of what the opinion polls were saying.
Well, it's a matter of opinion whether it's a judgment which should be left entirely to the people or whether they should be advised on exactly what you've just said, namely that this is likely a freak. I mean, Peter Kellner, if I might finish, John, Peter Kellner would argue to this day that was an accurate opinion poll and they were quite
sure, okay, well,
the way they did.
He's entitled to his judgment, but let's say, for example, there wasn't any public opinion polling. All right? Well, and let's say that YouGov were asked by the No campaign to do their private polling. And they gave the same result as they gave the Sunday Times. So private polling, banning the publication of polls, will not stop politicians taking decisions on the basis of polling information that is available to them.
And that is back to our discussion about whether we should really be looking at the inaccuracy of the media rather than the inaccuracy of the polls, the inaccuracy of the media and the failures of political judgment. But could I just, as a sort of an addendum to the point about the downside of polls, I know that nowadays we don't really talk about the markets in such discussions, but I mean there is quite a lot of evidence, isn't there, I think, that if, for example, there were to be a snap election this spring, or not necessarily a snap election, perhaps it's likely to happen anyway, there would be, I would have thought, a huge movement in the currency markets on the basis of polling which suggested that Mr Corbyn was going to be successful.
Perhaps, though, of course, that does depend on expectations. If people think that's what's going to happen, it gets priced into the market fairly quickly. I mean, the reason why the pound fell at the end of the day is, despite all the private polling that was going on polling day in the EU referendum, most people seem to have bet the farm that Remain was going to win, and therefore the value of the pound went down. Certainly, I mean, again, historically, this is long-standing issue. I mean, once upon a time, the stock market used to take fright when there was the possibility of the Labour Party winning. I mean, as an aside, I would suggest to you this time, let's say for the purpose of argument in a snap election, the Labour Party was campaigning in favour of a second referendum or staying inside the single market. I think, as we kind of know, the view of the markets as to which is the worst of the two devils may be somewhat more nuanced than you're suggesting.
Yeah, but I mean, as we've had in the last week, you get reports of Mr Corbyn making speeches in the city saying that he does intend to take fairly tough action against individual banks, etc. That seems to me that would be at least an issue in New York.
But again, you don't escape the problem, all right? Because
no, you don't escape the problem.
We know
I'm talking about the downside.
Sure, we know in the EU, yes, but it doesn't matter whether it's public or private, all right? Unless you are going to ban the taking of opinion polls entirely, because if it's done we know what happened in the EU referendum. In the EU referendum, because the one ban that we do have, which is on publishing information about how people have actually voted, a lot of people engaged various polling companies to do private exit polls or other kinds of on-the-day exercises. If we ban opinion polls for, let us say, 7 days, the markets will have a field day.
Oh yes,
right?
No, I'm not.
And because they're privately conducted as opposed to publicly conducted, there's no greater guarantee that the polls are going to be more accurate. So all that we will get, we will get the worst of both worlds. We will get the markets moving. And then, of course, some say, well, why are the markets moving? Well, we've had this, intelligence that it's the case, and we all know kind of the opinion polls, but none of us will be in a position to be able to judge, well, is this poll useless? What use should we make of it? Is it consistent with everything else, etc., etc.? We will just be all flying by blind, and I would suggest, I accept there are down risks with public polling, but I think the truth is the down risks are still going to be there with private polling, and at least with public polling, it's exposed to a degree of public scrutiny.
Well, I'm not challenging your point on that. I'm simply challenging the point you made earlier, which I think you've now slightly retracted, which was that there weren't downsides to opinion polling.
Oh, yeah, I accept that there are. I've accepted that I accepted that the way in which election campaigns can be framed can be affected by opinion polls. I'm merely suggesting that people exaggerate the degree to which the 2015 election was framed by the polls, and I would certainly also question the extent to which the Scottish independence referendum was covered. Other than the fact that at the end of the day the result definitely was much closer than most people anticipated at the beginning of the exercise, and certainly much closer than the UK government ever intended in allowing the referendum to take place in the first place.
We're reaching the end of the session, and if I could end on a quiet and dying note. In his report, Professor Sturgis recommended 6 changes, I think it was, to BPC rules. Mm-hmm. Have all those changes now been made?
They've all been made bar one, which is we're still working on the question of confidence intervals, but I'm hoping that our next AGM, which should be early in the new year, we will get that sorted. So all companies will be required to estimate the confidence interview within which their voting intention estimates lie, but otherwise everything else already. And indeed, in the case of the recommendations about being transparent about methodological changes, actually the companies followed the rules before we actually formally introduced them.
Okay, it would be very helpful, John, if you could do us a one-page note just saying what the position is on those particular inquiries. We want to get it right in our report. Anybody else? We've got 1 minute left. No? Well, thank you very much. I know it's been a long session, but
no, it's fine. Enjoyable.
I suppose we call a lively one. And
well,
I look forward to deliberating on all you say and reflecting in our report our conclusions on it.
Thank you very much. Excellent questions. Thank you very much indeed.
Cheers.
Okay, thank you.
Fine. Yep.
Okay, I'm going to ask Lord Hayward, Robert Hayward, to start off the questioning, if I may.
Can I just pick up on a thread which I know two of you at least heard me asking in the previous session, and that is on the question of social polling in terms of social issues and the difficulties that throws up. Can I ask you, from your own personal experience, the same question that I put previously, which is, does polling on social issues raise particular problems, and if so, how do you cope with them? Because there is a sense that somehow or another messages are misconstrued or deliberately conveyed in one way or another, basically to get very, very much their issue across. And possibly in asking that question, can I pick up on something that Baroness O'Neill asked? Could you indicate just very roughly where the balance of each of your businesses lies in terms of market research stroke political polling, just very roughly?
Well, I'll kick off. So Ipsos Mori employs about 1,200 people in the United Kingdom, and about 2 of those people work part-time on political polling, which is just to give you an idea of the scale. So it's not big business. About a quarter of our work is for the government, for charities, for public bodies. So that is substantial. Around 200 people doing that. The other 800 or more are involved in work for companies like Google or Procter & Gamble on commercial market research. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that asking about social issues is by definition more difficult. I mean, but the point, and the whole point, of course, is to try and avoid bias or leading people. It's really about one of the key challenges is how salient an issue is to people. So how much they know about it, how much they've thought about it, and of course, and that means that because particularly for issues where people don't have a lot of knowledge, how you frame the question or the information that you give people will obviously potentially bias the results if it's inaccurate, and there are areas where of course nobody agrees on what the correct information is. When that happens, we very often try and split sample the question, so we ask it in 2 different ways to try and understand the impact of the question wording on the responses.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Okay. So we're a far smaller company. We don't employ 1,200 people. We're about 20 people. We're split between here and Washington, but about 85-90% of the work we do is social and political research. But about 15 or 20% of that is in the UK. So we do a lot of the same issues, but abroad. I think, as you heard in the previous session, the answer very quickly turned to the questionnaire and the way the question is designed. And that is absolutely crucial, because that's where, if you're working for a certain campaign group who want to promote a particular issue, then they will have a way they want to ask the question, and any upstanding pollster will at that point say you cannot ask that way. And I can give you a very simple example here. So we, for a number of years, have polled for the Countryside Alliance. I've never gone a horse, I've never fox hunted or anything like that. I don't know, red coat or anything. Okay, but they, you know, one of their issues clearly is they want to overturn the ban of fox hunting. On the other side, you have people who work for the League Against Cruel Sports. Okay, so the way those questions are worded, you know, you can say, do you agree or disagree that setting dogs on cuddly foxes is a nice thing to do or not?
That sounds like a leading question.
That sounds like a leading question. But that's what they'll come to you with. So at that point, and this is the good thing about the British Polling Council, is that whenever anything is published, yes, you look at the data and you look at the regional, the demographic analysis, but what you should look at is actually the question wording, because that really is that's where there is room to manipulate data. You know, there's lies, there's damn lies, and then there's statistics.
Thank you.
Robert, could I just come in there? Because you say one thing is looking at the question wording. I don't disagree with that. But I've got a very fat file of these social issue polls. And what they mostly rely on to get the result they want is differential response rates. So the Royal College of Nurses showed that 40% of nurses, I think it was, were thinking of leaving nurses. This is, they sent a questionnaire to all their members, 7% responded, and who responds? The ones who are thinking of living in nurseries.
That's another. I mean, low response rates are another. Response rates for random probability samples like that, or samples of that type, are obviously a measure of quality. And they should be publishing the response rate with their survey. When you see it's only 7%, you then wonder, are the other 93% like the 7%, or have they weighted it for? Have the results been adjusted for the differdifferential?
You'd have had a job looking at the press reports to see that they only got 7%. When we rang them up, that's what
I think also if you read any textbook on research, one of the lessons that's sort of drummed into you very early on is your data is as good as the sample in which it's drawn. And when we had a discussion about the press earlier on, that there probably aren't sufficient people who really pay close enough attention to all the sampling detail. So in that case, you'd question exactly who responded to the survey.
Did you want to add to this, Mr. Lowe?
Yes, so Survation is a relatively new company, relative to, say, Ipsos Mori. Started in 2010 after the general election. In terms of our business, political and social research is probably up to 75% if you take the year of Brexit, down to about 25% outside of the political cycle, because we typically work with lots of different people across the political spectrum. In terms of where I'm at with this question, I'm very careful to protect a new company's reputation. So people typically pre-filter. They don't typically come to us with the idea that they're able to ask what will be a biased or leading question before we even get to see their idea of a script. It's unusual that we have to push back. That when we push back on the wording of a question, that's not taken on board. I can think of a couple of examples. One where it was related to Trident, and we argued back and forth over the phrasing of the question. Eventually asked the question the way we wanted to ask, and that poll was not considered, even though it was very favourable towards the client, not favourable enough. But in terms of the way that our role is that because of the BPC rules on transparency, my very good friends at YouGov and Comres and Ben here can very quickly go to the way the question was asked and shoot it down. It's a matter of professional reputation. Professional reputation is all a company like mine has. So where we do make mistakes, or where there is a question that's been misframed, it's easy for that to be subject to scrutiny, and it's not good for business to be seen as a company that gets the campaign exactly the result that they want.
Sorry, Robert, I interrupted you.
No, that's fine. That's all I wanted to ask at this stage.
In danger of talking too much as usual, Pippa.
To ask the question that I did actually ask just now to the BPC, so Johnny, you will have heard it, and that was about the extent of human judgment. As I understand it from other people that we've talked to, the polling companies, when they get the results, if they take a look at it and feel, this looks way out of kilter of what we think is reasonable in this context, there is this human judgment to adjust it. And I'd like to understand how you do that, particularly given the fact that the people making the decisions on that are probably influenced by the broadcast media and the newspapers and their friends they have dinner with, etc., the taxi driver they sat with, or whatever, just as we all do. You make your judgments based on what you're exposed to. And actually probably not from the sort of social media chat rooms that the younger generation are looking at. And therefore, when you're making these adjustments, you're making them inevitably with a certain form of bias.
Well, I remember one poll, which was the first poll we did of voting intention in Scotland after the Scottish referendum, and it showed the SNP doing absolutely amazingly well, which obviously they went on to do. I actually had the poll redone, because I just thought something must have gone disastrously wrong. So that, at my own expense, and of course it confirmed the same numbers, and then we immediately then published it. So I think what you're talking about here are smaller adjustments where you're making decisions, and what happens is that people have to make judgments. So, for example, our 2017 polling unusually, for pollsters, understated the Labour Party, and that was because of a decision that we had made about what had happened in 2015, where we had overstated Labour because we had too many young people telling us they were certain to vote. And so we used the British election study, which shows empirically that young people are more likely to overclaim their likelihood of voting than older people, to adjust the data. That gave us a number that seemed more credible, but actually, of course, effectively people's behaviour had changed. But I don't think when we're making these judgments, it really isn't about social media. I have 37,000 followers on Twitter. I love social media. I mean, I may only be talking to people like me, of course, who like opinion polls, or George folks who isn't here today. But I don't think it's that. It's more that we are, I think one key thing that we'd probably all agree on, we are driving with a backseat mirror. And so the methods that we're using and the adjustments we're making are ones that have empirically worked in the past or would have adjusted for problems in the past. But when the dynamic changes, and with young people's turnout now returning to levels that it used to be in the early 1990s, we're in a different situation. When that changes, we can't we won't know that that's changed until it's changed. So we are doing, effectively, polling is about what works. And all over the world, we're in 88 countries, different pollsters have got different local solutions which empirically work best in their country and can be shown to have worked. But when things change, then it's wrong. And that's where judgment does come in. And if I'm honest, again, but the referendum is another one of, the committee will probably regard that as a polling miss. We looked at the Scottish referendum. We looked at the trajectory of what had happened to voting intention in the polling that we were doing for the Cabinet Office during the course of that campaign on a daily basis, and we could see it swing from 55 Leave to 45. We looked at the 150 referendums around the world where the government of the day had endorsed the status quo and the outcome. And from all of those things, we made a judgment about the direction of travel. We had 53% for Leave the week before. On the day I woke up and it was 51% for Leave, and from Tuesday and Wednesday before the referendum. And we made a judgment, and it was the wrong judgment.
So, putting on to that, to what extent are these judgments made at the beginning, before you start the polling process, and then adjusted?
It's always afterwards.
It's always adjusted through the polling process.
And I think one of the challenges is, that I will shut up in a second, is that if we're honest, and again, looking at this empirically around the world, half the time the pollster improves the poll. The other half of the time, the pollster probably makes it worse. The difficulty is that we never quite know, which one it is at the time. And human nature is that actually, it's, you probably can feel justified about. I can always empirically justify the decisions I've made in the past, even if they've been wrong.
We have a slightly different perspective on that, if I may. So, I think Patrick Sturgis talks a lot about that tinkering doesn't work, because it often comes back to a confirmation bias that somebody might have, and it might send you the wrong way. What Survation did in 2017 was pick a method and not change the method. So there were not any last-minute changes. So you'll see in our final poll there's not a differential way of weighting don't knows. There's not a tweak here. There's not a tweak there. And I did that on purpose because I decided that if tweaking can only sort of lead you astray, and given that we were the only poll that had a hung parliament as our central forecast for both online and telephone, and all of the polling and most of the commentary was showing a different picture, any tinkering would have probably tinkered me away from the correct result. And so before the result, I decided to not do that, because I felt that I could only mess it up by my own actions. And we went into the final result without changing.
I think also, if you look back at history, my father did this for 30 years for Gallup. It was him and this chap there, and one at the Telegraph, one at the Times, and the polls, there were probably, 50 polls a year probably. It was a monthly basis. If you look at the curve of the frequency of polls since 2015 or 14, it goes like that for 50 years, and it just goes through the roof. There was significantly less tinkering done in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, possibly in the early 90s, than there is now. As polling people, when we get data back on any issue, the first thing, if we think it's wrong, we don't like that. And the first thing we look at is the sample. We repeat the survey at our own cost, because we don't. There's a reputation issue here as well. So we in 2017 we tinkered slightly. We took the education weight that academics have come up with, so basically you would, older people are more likely to turn out, so, you look at that, and an education weight based off a lot of evidence, some of it here, some of it from the US election cycle, and it didn't make it any more accurate. So
I think education did make, we'll argue about that, but yeah.
Ben, you just mentioned that you could empirically justify the tinkering, to use the technical term. I just wondered what the methodology was for understanding that and for the empirical evidence.
The empirical evidence is based on if you take the decision that we made in 2017 about the potential for overclaim by young people about their likelihood of voting and therefore being overrepresented in the final sample, that was based on what we could see empirically had happened in 2015.
But wasn't that was a judgment that was made before you started the polling process? I'm slightly more interested in what happened during the polling process. During the 2017 election, we didn't change anything. We don't start with an assumption that we want to get to, but it's when you're looking at that final number and saying, does this look plausible? How does it compare with what's happened empirically in the past? Then you have to make a judgment. Yeah, I'm trying to understand how that judgment is made. I mean, you mentioned that you redid a survey, which is obviously one way of dealing with it. But what else? It's a subjective decision. So you're looking at where you have been wrong in the past. So, for example, if you look at our 2015 result, 8% for the Liberal Democrats, they got 8%. Conservatives, I think we said 36, they got 37 point something. But we overstated Labour by about 4 or 5 percentage points. And then, of course, so because of that, we're then saying, right, so why was that this time and not in 2010? We were more accurate in 2010. And we look back and we could see that there'd been a change in the proportion of people telling us they were certain to vote, and that the people who were more likely to do so had been younger and working class. Having seen that, and having seen also from other surveys that pattern, one of the benefits of the British Election Service, they go back to the local authority to check that particular voter on the panel had actually turned up at the polling station. So you can see empirically that is what has happened in that sample, and there is not any reason to believe it wouldn't have been happening in ours. We could see that in the 2015 result, and as a result, we basically tightened the filter on young people. As it happened, they surged, and that was empirically, that was the wrong thing to do. We've now removed it as a result of 2017. But you are making these judgments, and the difficulty is that, Damien's right in the sense that you might be not better making them, but I can also point to other elections, like the Scottish referendum, where if we hadn't made an adjustment based on trajectory and other assumptions about the past, we would have been worse. And I think it's more about just being, you can react with horror at the idea of us trying to be right or making these are judgments of about 1 or 2%. So they are not only in when things are very, very finely balanced, which of course we've had a series of electoral events that have been. Do they make a huge difference? But it is about trying to be, ultimately it is about trying to be right. I mean, it is for no other purpose. Yeah, no, I understand that. And that's what we're doing. But we're trying to do it, we're not doing it because it's a sort of, this is the number we feel like. We're doing it because we could see something that appears that empirically in other polling or in our own in a recent election has been a problem. And so we're like people designing aeroplanes in a slightly less sophisticated way. When something's gone wrong, you try and fix the problem for the next flight. Thank you.
If that crashes too, however, it becomes
But airlines have become progressively safer because of that.
Yeah, that's true. It's true.
Given that, what you just said, to a certain extent you're correcting the last problem, of course you are, because that's what you have to base your decisions on. Do you think it is true that politics have become more volatile? It's certainly less easy to make a judgment on a vote from what sort of job someone has. Professor John Curtis mentioned in our last session that he thought there might have been a late swing on, a campaign swing, which is quite unusual for the EU referendum and indeed for the 27 election. So what I'm asking you is, do you think, based on all those possible changes, is it actually going to be, is it more difficult and therefore likely to get less accurate going forward?
It depends. Well, I mean, it depends what judgment you're using around accuracy. Because if it's about predicting winners, then having a series of very close electoral events, of course, makes that much more problematic, given the inevitable tolerances in any poll, however perfect. I mean, if we were back in the 1990s, nobody was fussing too much about polling accuracy because it was pretty obvious what was going to happen, and then lo, it happened. But I think society is more heterogeneous. There are changes. Our long-standing analysis of generational shift shows that there is a generational element to party loyalty, for example, and so party loyalists are basically dying out, and so the surge of the young to Corbyn at the last election isn't baked in if you look at the British social attitude study. So on that basis, you could argue that it might be a bit more difficult. But to be honest, if we're polling 2 days away from a general election, however volatile British politics is, unless there are sort of amazing events taking place overnight, or it shouldn't actually make that much difference. I mean, it may mean that if we saw voting, I mean, one of the biggest challenges for all pollsters is predicting turnout. It's asking people on a Tuesday or Wednesday, what are you going to do on Thursday? And one of the reasons why the exit poll has been so accurate, apart from John Curtis and his team's excellent analysis and weighting of the data, is also, of course, that we're interviewing people after they've voted, and we know they've voted, which gives us a huge advantage over just asking people, even on Tuesday, what they might do on Thursday. So that is a bit more, you could argue that that's all a bit more volatile, but we should really be able on Tuesday and Wednesday to have a reasonable read on it.
Thank you.
But I suppose a more simple way to answer the question would be the 2015 polling miss, of which observation was part in our online polling, was the main reason for that was said to be in the investigation unrepresentative samples. Now, turnout was an aspect of that, but I think that the primary reason was that samples needed to be more representative. I think the whole industry improved the representativeness of their samples where there had been probabilistic turnout based on the 2015 behaviour, where that was more part of your model than improving your sample. You were going to have the least accurate results, particularly in the context of a Labour surge. And there was a Labour surge, and assigning younger person behaviour, for example, back to how it behaved in 2015 in the context of 2017, with a committant Labour surge in support from 34 to the 20s rather to 41% by the election. Any method that would look to curb that enthusiasm that you were seeing in the public would make you less accurate, significantly.
But all the polls picked up a surge to Corbyn. I mean, it's this is one of the campaigns with the biggest swing on some measures since 1945, against an incumbent government. So, I mean, the election did not go as most people, including Jeremy Corbyn's inner circle, were expecting.
Pippa's asked much of what I was going to ask, very shrewdly and very, very appropriately. But let me try again a bit. You have to make judgments. You make judgments about your weightings, and you decide, for example, to perhaps based on what happened last time around, to take fuller account of what less educated people might do, or whatever. You tinker. This is the moment when you take real risks, isn't it? You take real risks for your reputation, you take real risks for your profitability.
Actually, there's an inverse correlation between our profitability and the accuracy of opinion polls. Right.
A very interesting business model.
Well, I think the main point you have to remember, and this is a serious point. One of the reasons that the exit poll is very accurate is that it costs £300,000.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why other polling will be less so is because the sums involved and the samples involved are much, much smaller, and the people who are spending hundreds of millions of pounds on research of all kinds are much more sophisticated consumers of it than the average journalist.
Anyway, as you mentioned, you're sort of looking through the rear window.
Yes.
And you're all reaching different conclusions, slightly.
Yes. Well, inevitably you will.
Conclusions about the tinkering
even if we executed the polls all in an identical fashion, with an absolutely identical methodology, and perhaps Pat or John Curtis could just prescribe a single methodology, even if we did that, The laws of statistics mean that there would be a margin of error, there would be a 3, 4, 5 or more points noise in the data. And we do need, with these sample sizes, we do need, people, that's one of the central challenges for everybody to be more cognizant of that fact. And the fact is the industry generally beats those margins of error, overall and all over the world repeatedly, but those are the margins of error. And 5 times out of 100, however good you are, your poll will be outside those margins of error.
But you are into an area of some subjectivity.
Absolutely.
And I'm interested in what you actually, to the extent that you feel free to tell us, what your internal processes are. Is it you as chief executives who simply take these decisions, or do you have panels of advisors? You must presumably be engaged in this process now, because we had an election just the other day in 2017, but it's entirely possible we'll have another election in 2018. So you must be getting ready for that, thinking, can you realistically extrapolate from what happened in 2017 to what might happen in 2018, 19, 20, 21, 22? I mean, how are you actually setting about to refine your methodology and get this better for next time? What do you do?
Well, we have a group of wise and experienced, well, you will debate wise, but certainly a group of people who are very experienced in looking at these things and have got reasonable track records and have done it for election after election. So there's a whole group of people who make judgments. Ultimately, as CEO, I have to agree or disagree with whatever's published. But we're looking at, we've looked at this, we continually look at things like sample profile. Have we got the right newspaper readership? Do we have the right proportion of people with degrees or not with degrees? Have we got the right number of are the young people that we're reaching in some way different from young people as a whole? Which is always a perennial question for all surveys. So all of those things go on. To be honest, we're not sitting, because of this, I think this is this key point, that this is a cottage industry, effectively. It may seem like a vast edifice, but actually this is something that we do, believe it or not, because we believe that it's important for this information to be public. We've always done it. And we think that without it, frankly, you would end up with journalists, politicians and pundits trying to tell everybody what everybody thinks. Polls, for all their problems, are at least an effort to, talk about public opinion as accurately as it can be measured. So we have a whole set of checks and balances. We do review it all the time. We look at all of the expert outside advice and guidance from the BPC and others. And ultimately, we're going to have to make a judgment which we stand or fall by. But I think being honest about the judgment and being honest about margins of error is something that we need to do. But the challenge is that if you go to the media and say, well, this one's just too close to call, so we're not going to publish, you can imagine, well, what are you hiding?
But yeah. I mean, the margin of error is absolutely crucial. I saw in your questions you ask about the way media report polls. I mean, the margin of error 19 times out of 20 is to correct within 3.5%. It's like the teeniest legal sort of the notes you see at the bottom of an insurance paper. You don't even bother reading it. So when it's a sort of 49, 51, 48, 50, it's the same thing.
Yes.
It basically means the same thing because the margin of error is that. But the journalists, if it jumps from 48 leave to 51 leave, the headline is the same, but the whole agenda of the paper changes. The markets react. 1.2% is lobbed off the pound overnight, but which is a fact which happens. On a question that costs £250 to ask to 2,000 people. The notion also that we're here getting fat on political opinion polling is not true at all. The newspapers don't pay for opinion polling now. They want it done within 24 hours or 48 hours. But the margin of error, as he says, is a point that is ignored.
Could I just ask a techie question? It may seem on margin of error. You're talking as if there is a scientific margin of error. There is, of course, for a proper random sample that reflects. I know of no statistical measure for the margin of error in a quota poll.
Correct. No, you're absolutely correct, and I think what we say is that those margins of error, of course, they also assume, when we're talking about all these margins of error, we're also assuming that the design effect is one, and is in fact that there's no other effects going on. So that a perfect sample, even for random probability samples, we're assuming that they're perfect. What we would say that is empirically, first of all, quota samples can be very good, and you get the right number of men and women on certain measures. But no, these are really mere rules of thumb that empirically have turned out to be accurate, but they are not based. You cannot say that they're based on statistical science. They're based on empirical method.
Yeah, I absolutely take that point.
Yeah.
However, it is a worry when we're talking about the difficulty of the media in communicating these points. It's actually taken a bit of drawing out to say what you're actually saying when you talk about margin of error, even before this committee. Three of the most expert people, I think only two have spoken, two of the most expert people in this entire industry.
I think that you were asking John Curtis in the previous session about standard deviation, and that was a work in progress. I think that's something that the industry struggles with, is that these are not random probability samples, and it's not honest to talk about a margin of error as a fact. It can be a guidance, but it isn't. And I think that's something that we're all considering. How do we report that, given that none of our work is random probability sample?
It's very helpful. Sorry, Barbara's next, and then you and Nora.
Thank you. I was just asking earlier about this idea of sort of regional variation, but also the disaffected voters and the ones who you think perhaps would be least likely to vote. However, some of this kind of big populist angry vote has come out in places such as UKIP. It could happen in other places. I just wonder how you deal with that. Is it something that you feel you can take account of on, previous performance, or do you feel that this is a new phenomenon? I'm thinking, was not just in this country. You've seen this rise of populism elsewhere, and I just wonder how you felt about that.
So it is difficult. I think we all carry out telephone polling. Is that correct? Johnny, you're a telephone polling, yeah. We're all carrying out telephone polling, and one of the ways that Survation tries to get the disaffected, perhaps lower income groups, perhaps lower education, perhaps the old, is via a telephone method that actively seeks out those groups in proportion. It's a pre-stratified sample of persons that we try to contact through mobile and landline methods that we consider to be representative of all people in the UK. The concept of that is because on online panels, lower education people of lower education aren't present. People over the age of 75 almost are completely absent from online samples because they're so difficult to reach online, and that's something that the telephone can bring to that. Notwithstanding that, I was looking at our online polling, which had hung Parliament as a projection, was very low on the Conservatives. It was a lot lower than the Conservatives than I would have liked, and I think it's that's come into play. And what we're trying to work on for the future is not only treating each election as a unique event, is also trying to improve the representativeness of samples, whether that's online or whether that's telephone, because I can see flaws in all of our work and my work as regards that, and I think it's a work in progress. It's also particularly difficult because there will be change of regulation next year with GDPR in terms of the way you're able to contact people and data permissions, and that's something that is going to be increasingly difficult to do.
It's a tricky situation. About 5 years ago we switched to a dual frame approach. So previously we just called people on a landline, okay? But there's about 16 or 17% of UK households that don't have a landline now, and that number is only set to increase. Okay, so you would do half 500. If you're doing 1,000 interviews, 500 would be to mobile, 500 would be to landline. But very often you're under like a sort of 48-hour. You must do this in 48 hours. Whereas we do a survey twice a year for a US client here, but they make us do it over 3 weeks. Then they make us call back people 5 times before we eliminate them, okay, from the sample. But that costs like $50,000-$60,000. Okay,
So
for 1,000 interviews. So you can do it.
It can be done.
But there's a time pressure, there's a cost element to it.
It becomes much more difficult. And I think it's a real challenge. How do you know that even when you've set quotas for having no qualifications, living in some, choose your place, having no job, etc., you may still be getting the ones who are more engaged, and you will never quite know, but you can at least account for key demographics. And actually introducing newspaper weights and education has made polls more accurate, and you can see that shift during the European referendum, for example. But it's a constant challenge, and it's something that's always been there for the industry. There's always people who don't want to do surveys, and the question is, are they different from people who do?
The point I'm making, that in the past, having campaigned myself, a lot of those people wouldn't have bothered voting, whereas it seems to be now you see this huge anger vote. It's how you get to those people, and the regional variation as well just seem to me.
Well, I think, one interesting challenge in British politics, of course, particularly, is this relationship between vote share and seat share, because, of course, there isn't any very simple, there is no simple relationship, and so you could be doing brilliantly in the marginals in particular regions, and it looks very different at the national level. And then, of course, there will be a surprise when you look at seat share in the House of Commons. That's possible.
The problem we have in regions is that 95% of our polls are either 1,000 or 2,000 sample size. It's only the Lord Ashcrofts that can fund the 50,000s. So if you have 12 or 14 government or ITV regions within the country, statistically, you're on very thin ice. Maybe outside of London, where you may have 300 or 400, you can't start drawing statistically reliable conclusions about the northeast versus the northwest versus the southwest, let alone a particular constituency.
But you can try and make sure you've got a decent spread by region, obviously. Cover them all.
Thank you.
Nora.
Yes, this may be a very idiosyncratic question, but I appreciate what you've told us about the importance of judgment. And it occurred to me that a poll that was published yesterday illustrated something rather interesting about judgment. It was an NHS poll, and they had established that the sorts of patients who are least likely to keep their appointments are young men of lesser education who make their appointments, and then if it's more than 2 days away, or if you fail to turn up and fail to call in to cancel. Is that sort of approach going to give you any greater degree of accuracy on voting intention?
Well, probably not, but it might just remind you that young men are a bit unreliable sometimes.
And very difficult to get in polls.
No, I don't. To be honest, it's a useful. The NHS has done all sorts of things on appointment keeping, and it's a useful reminder that different groups of people are, quote unquote, more likely to be unreliable. But it's because it's slightly separate from voting behaviour and what you're trying to measure there. I'm not sure it's a direct read across, but it's just perhaps another confirmation that...
But you do ask questions about how likely are you to vote?
We do, indeed. We do indeed. But how likely you are, I think, I haven't looked at the detail of that, but it may have been an empirical analysis from a system because they know the profile of the patient who was supposed to being turned up. They may just have noticed who hasn't turned up and inferred something from that, rather than just saying to young men, did you miss an appointment? So I'm not utterly sure about exactly the read across on that.
And I think you're onto something here. We're sort of torn. So do we believe people when they tell us how likely they are to turn out, or do we not believe them? So in Servation's polling, we went entirely. This general election went entirely for a believe them, even though we knew that some of the groups, such as 18 to 24s, were massively exaggerating their likelihood to turn out. So say 75% to turn out amongst 18 to 24s, it's very unlikely. We did find, though, that no turnout filter based on age, based on historic data, would have improved the accuracy of our polling. We were seeing exaggerations of all age groups, and when I looked at, under heavy criticism, I looked at some different ways to look at turnout. None of the methods would have made our Labour figure more accurate. Our Labour figure was very accurate.
I think the key point here is that there are differences and house effects between different pollsters for all sorts of reasons, and this is why some of the problems or challenges are different. There are some overall generalisations that you can make, but there are also so specific issues. So for us, youth turnout is with our methodology of sample selection is a bigger challenge than perhaps for other issues might be. So it's not everybody is not exactly the same.
And the difficulty, sorry, if I may, I'm just finishing up. The difficulty about what do you do? Because if the only data you have is historical data, some of the high quality data that Ben has talked about that he based some of his methods on, it was the only data that's high quality enough to be used. Before the election, we did try to work with the Electoral Commission on some of the indicators of turnout, such as the different rates of registration amongst different age groups, but to try to draw, and there was evidence that 18 to 24s were up 33% versus 2015, 25 to 34s were up 13% for net new registrations over the same period in the previous general election, but the data was hard to come by. It was sketchy as to how to work out what it meant in the grand scheme of things. We're still talking about lower numbers of people, so it was very difficult to decide what to do about turnout. It was probably the most difficult thing of all.
Just taking that particular point, you've explained some of the extremely complex decisions that have to be made, but also the very small teams you have working on political polling. And one of the things this committee might be wanting to consider is whether we don't do something that enables the polling industry to operate more at scale, to provide the kind of advice, research and help to companies that might enable them to improve their performance. And in some ways, the Commission des Sondages in France might be the sort of model on which we're working. Not telling you what you must do, but giving you guidance and expert advice. Are you in favour of that sort of idea?
I mean, I'm not anti it, but I'm not sure how effectively it works. My colleagues
I spoke to my colleague in France, the Commission des Sondages. So I think they have a ban for 24 hours, do they, beforehand? And there's supposed to be regulation. I think one of the frustrations, or one of the challenges the practitioners have is that those who sit within the Commission des Sondages aren't necessarily polling experts themselves and are slightly removed from the industry. That's not my view, that's one of the leading French pollsters' views. I think, there is a lot of regulation here. I'd argue that we're probably more regulated than colleagues in the US, in France, in Italy, in a lot of other democracies around the world. The BPC, I'm not sure what the Commission des Sondages would give us that the BPC does not give us.
Well, the BPC is essentially limited to, it starts from transparency, though it has increasingly occupied, as the Chairman has just explained to us, a role as a kind of industry body in giving voice to the concerns and answering some of the concerns that have been expressed. But I'm very surprised by the view you've just expressed that we have more regulation here than they do in France. Can you substantiate
where else? Okay, I can only talk from colleagues. I'm a vice president at Gallup International, so we're in 75 countries, etc. I can talk for colleagues in the US, in France, in Italy, in Germany. Within 24 hours, you do not need to publish your data. I put out a poll last night on a Brexit tracker. Within 24 hours, it has to be up on my website. When I say it means the full data disclosure and the question wording. And if it's not up within 24 hours, he's on my case within minutes. So to me, everyone has the right to see what I asked and what the data says. That wasn't around 10 years ago, and I know from personal circumstance how useful that is now. 10 years ago, Lord Saatchi leaked something that I'd done that's kind of suggested that the Tories would win 130 seats in 2005, and it was wrong. Okay, he wouldn't be allowed to do that now because I would have to publish. I have to publish within 24 hours. As far as I'm aware, and having spoken to colleagues around the world, that doesn't exist anywhere else.
Well, if you're comparing, though, the need to publish within 24 hours with an actual ban on polling, and you're saying, the need to publish in 24 hours is stricter regulation than a 24-hour ban, well, I would just have to wonder whether you're really confident of that judgment.
No, but with respect, you said to me, do you really think you are, there is a lot of regulation here? That was your original question.
That's right.
Okay, my answer as a practitioner is yes, and I compare that with colleagues in the industry across the other largest countries to carry out polling. I don't know. I mean, do you agree?
I would tend to agree. I'd also say that I think advisory groups or commissions to review things have been the Cabinet Office at one point was supposed to review all surveys of business. This was during the 1990s under John Major. And of course, it was either ignored or the poor man, I think it was one individual, was meant to be reviewing all of the surveys. Of course, business is busy surveying business all the time, but of course wasn't involved. It was every time government of any kind wished to do so. And it didn't work. And I mean, in our own organisation, because we're in 88 countries and political polling is much more important in some places like Italy where they have a lot more elections, or America where there is a lot more money involved in politics. And we've got actually a formal group of people now globally who review, before I in Britain can publish something, my colleagues who are worried about what I might do, or we now have external validation of that. But I think one of the difficulties in all of this is that if there was a simple and easy solution to any of the things that we're discussing today, it's very likely that we would have done them a long time ago. And what we're finding globally is that I can show you examples of face-to-face surveys that have done a perfect job in an election. It's largely been abandoned for political polling here for cost and other reasons. I can show you online polls that have been very, very accurate. In other places they haven't. And so there are some basic tenets, but actually it's still very evident that that different things seem to work empirically in different places. And consistently so. My colleagues in Ireland, working for the Times of Ireland, have consistently been very accurate with very traditional face-to-face surveys, which some of us might argue would be problematic these days. You know, you can't speak to anybody in a very short time face-to-face, but they seem to disprove us. So it really does depend. But we haven't found that more and more experts looking at the same thing necessarily improves the judgment that you ultimately have to make.
Could I just, to close this session briefly, talk about the relationship with the media, because in the course of the evidence we've heard in this committee, we've had at least as much criticism as my former profession as journalist, as of your profession as pollsters. It would be nice to have some insight into how those relationships work in practice and whether they're satisfactory generally.
Who wants to go first?
That's just a strange silence.
No, well,
no. I mean, practically, I don't think necessarily. I mean, particularly with social media and the need to push something out overnight, online, etc. There's probably not as much rigour as there should be when journalists review newspapers. If you talk to people at the Washington Post, they have a very set of 10 rules which are drummed into people before you're allowed to publish an opinion poll. APOR, the American Association of Public Opinion Research, has, I think it's 12 or 15 guidelines for journalists. So, do you understand enough about the sample? Have you looked at the question wording, etc., etc., etc.? So there is a checklist of things that the industry has, but I would argue, in my experience, that journalists want the story to justify the agenda or to push something out, and they're not necessarily spending enough time looking at the detail.
I mean, Sir Robert Worcester over the years has published, things like guides to publishing polls. We now do podcasts, and I mean, I think the subs have a lot to answer for. The headline, I think there was one newspaper headline in 2015 where it said, 1% up 1%. Which is clearly absolute rubbish, but it was seized on a poll that moved in the direction that newspaper liked. And now that, and being able to control the subs, I think, has probably become a little bit harder. We are making sure that all of the details of the survey, they're actually usually in the text. It's not too misleading, but there are issues about how much prominence a newspaper will give to a poll that it likes, as opposed to one that doesn't confirm its prejudices. And there's very little I can do about that because I don't regulate the media. We will correct them if they're wrong publicly, as we will any client who is misleading about something. But choosing what to publish and ignoring things like margin of error, or focusing on tiny changes that are not statistically, under any circumstances, likely to be statistically valid, are things that go on. And it's very, you can ask them not to do it again. If you can complain. I suppose you could stop giving them data. but there's a tension there.
But the days of the press release, when they would send you a press release 20, and say 24 hours, and you check all your press release, I mean, that's gone. That doesn't happen. I mean, we so rarely. I mean, who writes a press
But we can
release
insist
now?
on we can insist on sample size, fieldwork dates. We can put the questionnaires online, but there is still an issue. There is a selection process that newspapers go through about what is news, what to focus on, and what the headline should be. How much we regulate that in relation to coverage of opinion polling, I think, is a moot point.
Did you want to add?
Yeah, so a couple of things worth mentioning. I mean, I think just to stand up for some of the better practice, Survation do a lot of work with newspaper groups, so Mail on Sunday, Daily Mirror, Daily Record. Those three clients would be more frequent users of Survation polling.